subtítulos en español para esta reunión, visite https://translator.microsoft.com para introduzca nuestro código de reunión donde dice conversation code. El código es PRIKU. Introduzca su nombre donde dice your name. Elige tu idioma donde dice your language. Desplácese hacia abajo y elija Spanish a español. Haga clic en Join Conversation. Únese a la conversación en inglés.
Great, thank you. Okay. Additionally, if you would like to view live captions tonight for this meeting, you can click on the ellipsis, that's the 3 dots at the top of the screen, and scroll to the bottom of the menu and turn on live captions. The captions, just like closed captioning on a television program, will appear at the bottom of the page. So if you'd like to participate in that way, that option is available as well. Great. Okay. So with a little bit of administration taken care of, let's also look at our agenda tonight. First off, we'd like to introduce the team to you tonight. We'll talk a little bit about the project background, the work that's been completed to date, recap the work that's related from the public workshop #1 that occurred back in April, and also review the results of our public survey, the public hazard survey that was conducted over the course of the summer to help inform this project. We'll bring you up to speed on the assessment of hazards and vulnerabilities that currently exist within the county, that is informing the mitigation planning that is currently underway. And then the meat of tonight's meeting is focusing on mitigation strategies. So with an understanding of what hazards do exist, what can be done about them? That's our main topic tonight. Well, there'll be an opportunity for public comment at the end. So I ask that for all attendees, feel free to keep track of your questions, comments as we go along. You'll have an opportunity to provide those to us at the end. But let's get through the presentation so you have all that information, and we can have that discussion as a last step in the workshop. And then we'll talk to you a little bit about schedule and next steps for the project, and most importantly, how best to stay involved going forward. Great. So to introduce the team here tonight, you heard from Mike Dyer. He's the project manager from the county, from the Office of Emergency Management, and supported by JD, also from OEM. My name is Erica Leachman. I'm a project manager with Wood Environment and Infrastructure in Santa Barbara, and I'm supported here with Gina and Sydney tonight. They're our hazard planners working on the update of this plan. And we also are supported by Jeff and Dan, who are technical leads and specialists related to this topic, and also Santa Barbara County in general. So we're supported by a team of technical specialists who may or may not be here tonight, but wanted you to know who's behind these screens and working on this project on the county's behalf. Great. Tonight, since we're in a virtual environment, we're all getting very used to doing this after a couple of years of reacting to the COVID environment. But we wanted to introduce a couple tools that we'll be using tonight to encourage participation and get input. So during our presentation, there will be a couple opportunities to interact virtually using a tool called Slido. It's a website. So when you enter slido.com, SLIDO.com into your browser, you'll be able to interact directly with this presentation and the team here. We'll do an example of that in just a minute, but I wanted to encourage everyone to bring up a separate browser, put Slido into the web address, and have that ready to go, because we'll be using that tool during this workshop. And then, as I mentioned later on, we'll have an opportunity for public comment. During public comment, there is a feature to raise a hand if you do have something that you would like to give verbally. You'll see at the very top of the screen, there's a little icon raising a hand. You can use that if you have something that you would like to contribute. And also feel free to enter questions into the chat box. That's something that we'll be going through at the end of the meeting. Also know that we're recording this meeting. If you have any concerns about that, just let us know. If that's something that you don't want to be part of. But then the meeting will be available after the workshop, or the recording will be available after the workshop.
I think there's a question. Somebody has their hand up. David, do you have a question about how to participate?
It looks like the chat option is disabled.
Oh, well, thank you for bringing that up, David. Let's look into that really quick. I think we can probably turn that on, and if not, we can stick to verbal comments. We'll try and troubleshoot that before we get to public comment at the end of the meeting.
Yes, I'll play around with the meeting options right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Let's move on to our first exercise.
Okay, so if you've never used Slido before, it's super easy. All you have to do is open a separate browser on your phone or on your computer. Enter slido.com and enter the code 035676. And from there, it's going to ask you your first question, which would be really easy. It should pop right up on your screen as soon as you enter that code. I'm getting a message for you. Just let me know if you're not able to hear me. Oh, great. I see a couple people have already logged on. Thank you for doing that. We're just curious as to who's joining us today, what areas are represented. If anyone's having any issues with the Slido, let us know in the chat or raise your hand and we can definitely help you out. I looked at the meeting options and it looks like all participants are enabled to use the chat box. So if that's not working for you, you can always raise your hand and give a verbal comment at the end or now while we're doing these interactive slides too. All right, it looks like we have some good representation from a couple different areas, mostly the South Coast, but we have some folks from San Maria Valley, Lompoc Valley, and San Ynez Valley as well. Love to see it. Thanks for all of you coming. And there'll be many other opportunities to participate. So we'll give everyone another second and then we'll move on to some of our project background information. All right, thanks for participating. I'll hand it back to Erica.
Great, thanks, Gina. Okay, so there may be folks tonight who did participate in our first workshop back in April. But for those who haven't, we didn't want to pick up where we left off without giving some context. So let's recap a little bit about what we've done since the workshop number one. First of all, workshop number one kicked off this project. This project is a mandatory project that happens every 5 years, and so we wanted to make sure folks understood where the project was coming from, what we were working on, including some project background, the regulatory environment that the project is being conducted within, and also overviewing the steps of the process, the project components. And at that point, probably most importantly, was encouraging participation in our community survey. So getting input directly from the public, from the communities that experience and have the best local knowledge about the hazards that they face, to give that direct input to the planning team so that we can react and ensure the plan meets the most current and up-to-date needs of the county. So that was the main thrust of the of workshop number one. Go to the next slide. Here we go. So a little bit of background just for folks tonight. And we need to ask the question, why is the HMP being updated? Why do we do this? A hazard mitigation plan has a very important role for Santa Barbara County. It is a plan that identifies very specifically what the range of hazards are that exist within our communities. It identifies what's vulnerable as a result of those hazards. And then the most important thing is that it comes up with and implements mitigation strategies that reduce, remove, compensate for, and address those hazards to ensure our communities are as safe as they can possibly be. And in the face of disasters, in the face of hazards, also sets up the county, residents and first responders and planners and everyone involved to respond and recover in a way that is timely and cost efficient. So as you can see here on the screen, every dollar invested on disaster prevention saves $6 in costs related to response and recovery. So the more prepared we are to respond to disasters when they inevitably happen, it ensures that our county can recover, our communities can rebuild, and that we can ideally avoid the risks and vulnerabilities that are inherent with hazards within the county. The other thing to know is that the update of the HMP is a mandatory action. The HMP it needs to be updated every 5 years, and it has to comply not just with local regulations. Our update is required by FEMA and also by Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services. So when we're updating these plans, we're working within a regulatory framework that guides precisely what needs to be addressed, how it's addressed, and how it's reported in the plan. So that's something important to know, that this is not something that is being driven entirely by the county. It's driven by a requirement trickling down from the federal government to ensure the county is well positioned to receive funding in responses to emergencies going forward. The next slide. Great. As I mentioned, the HMP update is subject to existing regulations, and one of the key regulations is the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. This act at the federal level requires that local governments have a mitigation plan. So this isn't just for the county. This applies to the cities. This applies to other counties. This is a nationwide requirement. And why it's important is because these plans ensure that our local jurisdictions are eligible for funding, both for pre and post disasters. It helps us afford the mitigation that are included in the plan. The plan also guides activities in a coordinated and economically sound manner. And what that means is that oftentimes with hazards, they don't care about boundaries. They don't care that there's a city boundary around the city of Lompoc, or that the unincorporated area between Goleta and Santa Barbara is there. A hazard will just happen, and oftentimes it requires multiple jurisdictions to respond in a predictable way. And so a multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan like we have in Santa Barbara County is essential for coordinating those activities, identifying roles, establishing shared responsibilities, both for the mitigation itself and the funding for different mitigation activities. So it's a really important tool and a required tool to organize that. The other thing that's important about the hazard mitigation plan is that it brings together existing planning. So from a diversity of stakeholders and participating agencies into one place, so the full capabilities of the county can be understood. And it also is instructive in identifying how things are built and ensuring that future development is responsive and avoids hazards that are known within the landscape. It helps improve the way that we build buildings, how we site things, how we redevelop things in the future and retrofit things. And ultimately, all of these measures come together to avoid and reduce the losses that can happen in response to various hazards. At the end of the day, the goal is to make communities more disaster resilient, make us a stronger community, able to bounce back in response to things that happen and avoid problems from the get-go. Great. So within our county, as I mentioned, this is a multi-jurisdictional plan update. The lead for this update is the county and the Office of Emergency Management. But on behalf of the 8 cities and 5 special districts, the plan is being updated and carried forward as one multi-jurisdictional plan. So with our 8 cities, along with the Kachuma Operations and Maintenance Board, Carpinteria Valley Water District, Santa Maria Valley Water Conservation District, Montecito Water District, and Montecito Fire Protection District. Those 14 agencies, I think it's 14, 13 agencies are all part of this plan. And when we get through the update, the individual plans for those agencies will be part of the larger plan. The planning that goes into this document is also directly informed by non-governmental organizations or other interested parties, and also our public stakeholders, which tonight is one of our important outreach to the public to have some feedback and some input into this process. Great. So with that little bit of background and some explanation about why we're here and what we're doing, I wanted to turn it over to Gina to share with you a summation of the results of our public survey. The survey was conducted to get some valuable input, and I hope you find this input as engaging and important as I do. So I'll turn it over to Gina for this.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So our survey was live from March 25th through September 15th of last year. And during that period, it was emailed out multiple times, available on the website, and advertised through the County of Santa Barbara channels. And through those, we were able to receive 320 responses to the survey. It was posted on social media. It was emailed out over several months. So we got a decent amount of feedback. Now I'm going to show you how that feedback was distributed geographically. One of the questions that we asked the survey respondents was, what is your zip code? Because we wanted to get a sense of where the people were coming from and what hazards were most important to what areas. Mostly the results skewed towards the South Coast, and the issues brought up are reflective of that, which we'll talk about in a second, some of the results. But I just wanted to draw your attention to down here, which is blown up over here. We got a lot of results, the most results actually from the 93117 zip code, and fewer results in the San Ynez and Santa Maria areas. Thinking about what kinds of hazards and what kinds of mitigation strategies were popular in the survey responses, just keep in mind that it has a little bit of a South Coast skew. So the first question that we asked in the survey was, have you experienced any personal or economic loss from any of the following hazards? And this was a multiple choice question. Unsurprisingly, the most common responses were power outages and energy shortages and wildfire. Those were by far and away the things that had the most responses. And you'll see the answers that were available for multiple choices are down here, and the number of responses is on the y-axis. Drought and water shortage and pandemics were also really popular responses. Those were the third and fourth most common responses. And then some of the things that are also kind of typical: flooding, extreme heat, earthquakes, also ranked moderately high. There was also an option to write in your own answer here. And the most popular other answer was cannabis and cannabis-related issues like smells and fumes. Other write-ins that were popular included traffic, airport noise, police violence, and mass shootings. The next question we asked in the survey was, which of the following would you consider to be the most threatening hazard to your community? This was also multiple choice with the hazards that were listed on the x-axis and the number of responses on the y-axis. Wildfire was by far and away the thing that people considered to be the most threatening hazard to them, followed by droughts, earthquakes, and power outages, and then utility failures coming in at a moderately high level. This is very similar to the last question, and also, again, cannabis was the most popular write-in option here as well. We also asked, what do you think could be done to minimize the risks of the most threatening hazards you identified above? Select your 3 preferred options. So this one was multiple choice and had a write-in option, and you were allowed to select multiple responses. And the most popular strategy that was chosen was provide training, education, and outreach to prepare citizens for disasters and local hazards. This also came up a lot later when we asked for suggested mitigation strategies. A lot of folks want there to be more outreach and education done so that they feel prepared for different hazards. Another popular response was employing natural resources to reduce hazards, such as wetland protection, riparian buffers, and low impact developments. And then the next most popular one was adjusting zoning laws to limit development in disaster prone areas, like in floodplains or maybe high fire severity zones. A couple other write-in strategies that were popular were included building more desalination plants and encouraging more recycled water usage, limiting housing development to avoid drought conditions, building more housing, potentially reduce fire risk from houseless folks, fire prevention strategies like clearing vegetation, fixing roads, and enforcing odor regulations on cannabis. As you can see, there was a theme there for the write-ins. Another multiple choice question that we asked the survey respondents was, which of the following steps has your household taken to prepare for a local hazard? And for this, we were trying to get a sense of how prepared is the community already for some of our hazards. Most of the respondents said that they registered to receive emergency alerts, which perhaps is unsurprising because if you're going to be one of the people taking a hazard mitigation survey, you are probably already signed up for those emergency alerts. Many folks had identified utility shutoffs around their home and community, and many had prepared a disaster supply kit. That was also one of the highest ranked mitigation strategies that was suggested later. A couple of people wrote in responses, such as that they have a ham radio, they've installed solar panels, they've studied their local evacuation routes, and they've cleared brush around their home. Excuse me. We also wanted to get a sense of where people get their information from. So we asked, what sources do you rely on hazard impacts, emergency response, and recovery before, during, and after a hazardous event? Most people said that they check the county website to make sure that they have the right facts. People also said that they read a lot of online news sources. And over here, I put down some of the write-ins, and you can see that EdHat and News Talk were really popular online news sources. Some people received emails from the county. Some people looked to their local fire and police departments or emergency responders for updates, and TV news rounds out the top 5 responses. And you can see a couple other things over here that I think are interesting are some people signed up for Reverse 911, which is a service that calls you in case of emergency. And then also phone apps were really popular, like Pulse Point and Nix, which offer emergency. Rachel, I see your question about how the survey outreach was conducted. We emailed it out, we used social media, there was a press release, there was a media outreach campaign throughout the summer, and then we did 2 rounds of that to make sure that anyone who didn't see it the first time around hopefully could participate in the second round. We also asked folks to identify areas in their community or in the county that were vulnerable to specific hazards. So for this question, we were hoping that folks would help us identify specific areas that we need to pay more attention to in this next mitigation plan. This was an open response question. So for this one, I just tallied up the most common responses in the open response. And there were many, many more than this, but as long as it had more than one person respond, I tried to include it on this table. The most were homeless encampments. Most people here said that they were worried about fires in those areas, and they were worried that those folks would have limited ability to get emergency notifications. Foothill areas, especially because they're in high fire areas. Folks were concerned about coastal areas for a variety of reasons, such as erosion, eucalyptus trees being flammable, and sea level rise was another popular response. And then other folks said that they were worried about evacuation routes, such as the 101 and Highway 154. People were concerned about how they would get out of their cities or what would happen if there was a major highway closure over an extended period of time. Forested areas, power grids, and the wildland-urban interface, those were all really popular responses for talking about threats from wildfire. There are a lot of other places where people mentioned places in their communities that didn't fit onto this table, but these were the most popular responses. Next, we asked people to think about people instead of locations. Please identify any vulnerable members or groups of your community that may be at risk before, during, or after a hazardous event. What resources or services would assist these people to better prepare for, cope with, and recover from the impacts of these hazards? So this again was an open response question that I tallied the most common responses from. The general trend is that the current notification systems, people didn't feel like they were adequate. The biggest community group that people were concerned about were the elderly. There are a lot of responses saying that they were concerned about their disabled and disabled neighbors and people with medical issues. A lot of folks were concerned about homeless encampments. Folks wanted more outreach to non-English speakers. People with mobility issues might not be able to evacuate, and people wanted to make sure their neighbors that were maybe restricted to their home had ways to receive information and get out. People were concerned about low-income folks, people who live alone, children. A couple of people wrote in that said that they were concerned about pets and animals, especially since some evacuation sites don't allow you to bring your pets, and that prevents people from evacuating in case of an emergency. In terms of specific locations, a lot of people were concerned about the Encino Royale community. A lot of people were concerned about folks' inability to use technology or be able to read or verbally understand communications, especially if they're only offered in English. So a lot of themes here, a lot of concern over specific communities that we'll definitely take note of when we're writing mitigation strategies. In this question, we asked what resources or services would assist vulnerable members or groups in your community to better prepare for, cope with, and recover from the impacts of hazard events. And for this, perhaps unsurprisingly, community education and outreach was the most popular response. People said that they wanted multilingual outreach, they want community organizations to get involved. The other most popular responses were that folks want local organizations and neighborhood cohesion, especially after the pandemic. I think people feel like their communities are really fractured and they want to know their neighbors so that they can all collaborate in case of an emergency. Better communication and outreach was a really popular option, and so was providing materials and supplies to prepare for hazards. For example, people wanted to know where they could get blankets, generators, food, and water bags in case of an emergency. Another popular strategy was offering more hotel rooms, emergency housing, shelters, and evacuation areas. This was particularly directed at houseless folks to prevent fires. People wanted more outreach to vulnerable communities. People wanted more access to training, such as CERT and FireWise training. And people want to feel like their hazard plans are communicated well in advance and are transparent. They want to know where their evacuation routes are. They want to know what they're supposed to do in case of an emergency. And they want there to be a financial and social structure in place to make sure that they're prepared. A lot of these will be looped into mitigation strategies now and after this as well. So that's it for me from the public survey responses. I'm going to hand it over to Sydney to now get into sort of the nuts and bolts of the plan and talk about the hazards that we identified over the past few months.
Great, thank you, Gina. So as part of the hazard assessment chapter of the hazard mitigation plan, our team identified hazards that can threaten our community. Thank you, Gina. So this included refreshing our understanding of the known hazards that were included in the 2017 hazard mitigation plan, such as earthquakes, severe weather, and oil spills, which have not changed substantially since publishing the 2017 hazard mitigation plan. And this process also included researching and assessing new hazards that have either become more severe in the last 5 years within the county or were just touched on in the 2017 plan. So these hazards might include wildfire, drought, flood, mud flow and debris flow, pandemics, and coastal hazards like sea level rise. So the hazards assessment of the plan focuses on what hazardous conditions have changed substantially in the last 5 years. To assess the priority of these hazards, we looked at the results of the public survey that Gina just described, and we also asked the Mitigation Advisory Committee to look at 4 factors for these hazards. So that includes the frequency or probability of the hazard occurring within the county, the geographic extent of the hazard or where these hazards occur within the county, the potential magnitude or severity of the hazard if it were to occur, and the overall significance of the hazard. So once we understood how these hazards were rated for all 4 of these factors, we were able to prioritize them. And we also organized the hazards by the 4 main categories that you can see here on the slide. So the hazards are organized, by these categories and then ranked from highest priority to lowest priority. All right, next slide. Thank you. So in the vulnerabilities assessment chapter of the plan, we summarize the impacts created by the interaction of, sorry, I see your comment about repeating the criteria again, of course. So the criteria that we looked at for prioritizing the hazards were the frequency or probability of the hazard occurring within the county, the geographic extent of the hazard or where the hazard would occur within the county, the potential magnitude or severity if the hazard were to occur, and the overall significance of the hazard. So we looked at those 4 factors. We asked the Mitigation Advisory Committee to rank the hazards based on those 4 categories, and we also incorporated the results of the public survey that Gina just talked about in order to prioritize the hazards in that list that was on the last slide. All right, and getting back to the vulnerability assessment. So the vulnerability assessment chapter of the plan summarizes the impacts that are created by the interaction of the hazards that we identified in the hazards assessment and the county's key assets or critical facilities. So critical facilities are what FEMA considers lifelines and infrastructure that are important to communities. So examples of these are important roads within the county, fire stations, electrical substations and other energy infrastructure, health and medical facilities. These critical facilities also include facilities that were identified by the participating agencies like the cities and the special districts as important. So like schools is an example. So after we assess the hazards, our team models where these hazards are in the county in relation to the county's critical facilities in order to see what has the potential to be affected or to see what is vulnerable to these hazards. And again, to point out what's changed since the 2017 plan, we should note that we looked at vulnerabilities more clearly affected by climate change, and we took a closer look at the hazards that are disproportionately affected disadvantaged communities to see how these communities are particularly vulnerable to these hazards. And now we're going to show you some examples of these in the vulnerabilities assessment with a few maps that overlay hazards in the county's critical facilities. And we're not going to show you all of the hazards that we created maps for, but we'll show you a few of the key vulnerabilities. Next slide. Thank you, Gina. All right, so this is the map of critical facilities and fire hazard severity zones within the county. As you can see, the clusters of critical facilities, which are the colored dots on the map, are primarily in urban areas in the cities of the county. So critical facilities in unincorporated areas of the county are more vulnerable to hazards like wildfire than critical facilities in cities for a few reasons, because it's harder to access them. They may be farther from medical facilities and other FEMA lifelines, and the transportation infrastructure within the county is also vulnerable to these hazards because these hazards like wildfire could cut off access in or out of these remote communities. This also shows that energy networks are vulnerable to hazards, and if shut off, this could not only impact the remote communities of the county, but that could impact urban communities too. So you can see here that the probability of wildfire in the county is highly likely. We've been seeing fires every year or almost every year, and these fires have high or very high severity in the county. So for these reasons, wildfire is a high priority hazard in the county. All right, and our next slide talks about flood. So another high priority hazard in the county is flood. And this is related to fire because wildfire burns the vegetation of an area, and after, if a rainfall event occurs, it is more likely to produce flooding without the vegetation to hold the water runoff. So this map combines two different data sets. We're looking at the FEMA floodplain in blue, which is associated with insurance rates, and that's how we usually assess flood or flood zones within the county. And the pink zones shown on this map are an advisory layer that are prepared by the state that shows where more studies are needed to understand flood risk. So for our analysis, we're looking at both the FEMA floodplain and the Department of Water Resources flood advisory areas to show what areas are at risk. And flooding is likely to occur and can be severe, as we've seen in multiple instances of the county, so it is also a high priority hazard in the county. All right. Another hazard that's related to both fire and flood is the risk of mud flow and debris flow. This hazard is a combination of these other factors. For example, it is the risk primarily limited to hillside watershed areas, and it occurs post-fire and after rainfall events usually. We learned this formula in 2018 during the Montecito debris flows, and because of that, the county now has a better idea of where to initiate evacuation warnings, like after the Alisal fire that just occurred. And although Alisal is a rural area, there are still people and structures in that area that were threatened by the combination of fire and rain, which triggered evacuations in order to mitigate the hazard. So this is also an example of a hazard that's new to this plan. Debris flow risk was barely touched on in 2017, and this is the first time that the hazard mitigation plan includes debris flows as its own hazard, separate from landslide and separate from flood. But as you can see here on this map, we have a partial understanding of debris flow risk. This map shows the risk of debris flow due to several recent fires in the South Coast. So that is where our understanding of debris flow risk is in the county. But we are continuing to get more information, and every time we go through this process of hazard mitigation planning, every 5 years, we'll be able to fill in these data gaps. All right, so this map shows the effects of sea level rise in the county, and sea level rise is a great example of how there are differences in vulnerabilities to hazards in the different planning areas and planning regions of the county. So that response and mitigation to the hazards might be a little bit different in these different regions. Because sea level rise is a coastal hazard, this is mainly an issue for vulnerable critical facilities and communities in the South Coast. So our next map zooms in on the South Coast to show where the sea level rise hazards occur in relation to the critical facilities within the South Coast. Next slide. All right, thank you. So this map shows the areas of the county that would be inundated with flood flows if any and all of the dams in the county were to fail. So dam inundation is a hazard that has a low probability of occurring in the county, but if it were to occur, the impacts would be very severe, as you can see in this map. And again, this map shows how this hazard could cut off communities by flooding highways, such as Highway 154, which would force county residents to use an alternative highway like 101 if a dam were to fail. All right, and I'm going to pass the mic back over to Erica to discuss some mitigation strategies and what we've been doing to develop a mitigation plan.
Great. Okay. I wanted to check. We were hoping to go through the presentation and take comments and questions at the end. I see a couple of hands raised. Are these clarifying comments or questions, or is it something that can be held to the end?
Well, this is Christina McGinnis, and I apologize. I'm accidentally signed in as Craig Smith, and that's not, we just share a Microsoft Word program, so apologies for that. But I just wanted to interject, the Partnership for Resilient Communities has data collected for 41 debris flows over the last 200 years and related, flood events. And I just want to make sure that that data has been incorporated into your analysis, because it is recent, it is comprehensive, and it really needs to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. We'll follow up with you independently about that. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, terrific. Great. So turning now to the focus for tonight. So having that as background, understanding where we've been, what's informing the analysis, we now want to talk about step 3, which is arguably the most important step of this project, and that's developing the mitigation plan for the next 5 years. The purpose of setting a mitigation plan is to put on paper the independent measures that the county and the participating agencies will take to implement in the county over time to help to mitigate the hazards and the vulnerabilities that have been identified. One critical step in that process is setting the goals for mitigation. So based on the input that we've received, based on the technical analysis that's been conducted in terms of vulnerabilities, identifying the goals, what outcomes should we achieve over the next 5 years, is incredibly important in organizing and identifying the appropriate mitigation measures for this update. The goals set the guidelines, and that explains what the community wants to achieve with the plan. And based on that framework for goals, the mitigation options are pretty broad. The process that our team goes through, working with the county, working with the Mitigation Advisory Committee, is a stepped process. First of all, looking at the status of old mitigation measures. So in 2017, a mitigation program was put forth and adopted, including several mitigation strategies ranging from physical improvements in the county to ongoing programs. So this is our opportunity to audit that old program and identify those measures that are either still valid, haven't been completed yet, need some adjustments to be more relevant, but ultimately are recommended to continue on. And then for hazards and vulnerabilities that need additional mitigation, our focus is on planning and identifying additional mitigation measures that will address those issues. Pulling mitigation strategies from local, state, and federal documents, for example, local safety plans, safety elements for different jurisdictions. Often that's where a lot of the hard work has been done by local agencies to identify actions and programs that would be appropriate for that jurisdiction. So pulling from local documents and state documents is a good place to start for how to modernize and ensure our mitigation program is relevant and timely. Also thinking about measures for the protection of properties, structures, and property values, as well as natural resources, is an important step in considering mitigation. And then stepping back and looking at things a little bit more programmatically, understanding where our capabilities are in terms of emergency services and response, and also what programs and capabilities we have in terms of public outreach. You'll notice on our slide tonight, readysbc.org is a website that everyone here should visit and sign up to receive updates and information. And that's an example of a mitigation strategy that can help encourage outreach and information sharing related to safety during disasters and other hazardous situations. There's also, as I mentioned, individual projects. So installing a new culvert in a particularly vulnerable flood zone. Making changes to roadways to make them more resilient to different hazards. So actual individual capital improvement projects. And then also, as we're discussing tonight, some of our best ideas come from the communities that we're engaging in. So our survey results, direct input from community members with ideas, things that are not currently implemented in the county and should be. Ultimately, at the end of the day, all of these different sources can inform a mitigation plan, and that becomes the most critical chapter of the updated plan. Next slide. So what can mitigation measures include? Since the topic tonight is discussing new mitigations or refined mitigations that would be appropriate for Santa Barbara County, let's talk a little bit about what mitigations look like, what they can look like. First of all, mitigations can take the form of development standards. And what that is standards for how things are built or where things are located, how they're operated, that sort of thing, when a new project is going through a permitting process. So, for example, requiring new development to be resistant to earthquakes with retrofits and reinforcements, things like that, consistent with the building code in California and locally. Another example is limiting development within a floodplain to prevent the inevitability of a structure becoming vulnerable to flood in an area that we know is hazardous. Those are some pretty simple examples, but to demonstrate that concept that we can adopt development standards in the interest of hazard prevention, that's one technique. Another type of mitigation is an action item. So identifying a specific action, a specific project, a specific improvement, such as installing culverts or listing critical facilities and updating maps so that we have updated working maps throughout all jurisdictions within the county. And lastly, thinking about programs. So something such as a mutual aid network or a particularly effective outreach campaign that aligns with the goals associated with a particular hazard. That's another way that we can mitigate the risk associated with different hazards in the county. So when we're thinking about hazards, these are kind of the categories we want to think about. And then the second thing to think about related to mitigation is considering different alternatives. For different risks and different hazards in the county, there's a lot of different ways that we could go about addressing them, potentially endless. And so when we're making decisions about recommendations for mitigation, there's questions we want to ask about to ensure we're picking the right alternative, the best range of mitigations and the most feasible range of mitigations to address that hazards. So asking questions like, will the mitigation work? Is it cost beneficial? Is the cost versus the benefit reasonable? Can it be afforded? Is it something that is within the abilities of a local jurisdiction to undertake? Is it legal? Is it fair? Do people even want it? So, for example, a great example related to flood is there's plenty of things that can be done about flood from an engineering perspective. Big culverts, filling wetlands, putting up walls, there's lots of options, but we have to weigh whether or not if the solution is something that is desirable for the particular community, feasible, desirable, etc. We want to strike that balance. There's other things to consider, such as administrative burdens. Is it politically acceptable? Is it environmentally sound? And then last but not least, is funding even available for the mitigation? So when we're considering mitigations and putting forward recommendations to county decision makers and local decision makers, those range of mitigations need to meet these. We need to say yes to each of these questions going forward. Great. So thinking now about our update in our county and the goals of this update. There's several goals that we wanted to present tonight as a kind of a framework for thinking about mitigation in the county. First of all, goal one, we want to develop resilience to natural hazards in our built environment. So ensuring that new development and redevelopment is designed and located in a manner that is either avoiding of natural hazards or resilient, meaning that responding to and rebuilding or responding to a post-disaster environment, that we're prepared to react to that. Secondly, protecting those critical facilities and infrastructure that Sydney was presenting. In the face of natural disasters or other hazards, retaining the capabilities of those critical facilities is essential. If the critical facilities go down and we're not able to actually implement the mitigation measures that rely on them, that would be a problem. So that goal is an important goal in terms of hazard mitigation planning. Third, we want to highlight the importance of outreach and coordination. So having these mitigations in place is one thing, but ensuring that folks know what to do, when to do it, and how to go about it is just as important. Four, we want to address urban and human-caused hazards. In addition to natural hazards such as fire and earthquake, we need to also consider those things that are caused by our own built environments. Things like cyber threats, things like civil unrest, and the pandemic. The pandemic is one of those. That's something to highlight specifically in this update that was not a focal point for the last update. And last but not least, prepare for climate change. This is something that has been part of the hazard mitigation plan for a couple cycles now in Santa Barbara County, but is becoming a more a greater concern and a more imminent concern. And so we want to make sure that that's being considered within this 5-year time frame and also as a framework for future updates. So with that as a background, we wanted to just go through a few examples. In working with the Mitigation Advisory Committee and preliminary planning by the Hazard Mitigation Planning team, that we wanted to present a few examples related to these goals, so that you know where we are, what type of mitigations are on the books and being considered right now, and also to help shake loose any ideas and some discussion points. So, for example, thinking about the built environment and development standards. Examples of good strategies for mitigation include discouraging new construction in hazardous areas, of course. Also addressing permit requirements for emergency work in terms of responding to allow for response. Considering new requirements for new development that would improve the way that things are built or where they're located. And then also measures to target existing structures that are not as resilient as they could be to various hazards. So a good example of that is fire-safe retrofits for structures that are vulnerable to wildfire. They were built in the high fire zone, or the high fire zone has changed and increased its range to bring structures that are formerly not vulnerable into an area that is vulnerable. So that's something to think about as the climate changes our profiles for different hazards. So turning now to goal 2, thinking about critical facilities and infrastructure. Some examples, and I should also mention these are examples. It's not a complete list. It's more just to give you an idea of some range of mitigations that are available for these different goals. But thinking about critical facilities, starting first with renovations. So needed renovations to increase resilience to various hazards. Upgrading and relocating facilities, including transmission lines or pipelines. Increasing the capacity of debris basins paired with sediment management. So in the case of post-fire conditions, when the county and local cities are dealing with debris and increased sediment from runoff areas, what to do with that sediment that would be beneficial in the interest of hazard resilience. Also, with so many modern technological tools, using GIS mapping and new technologies to improve the way that we track and map and monitor hazards in the county is a mitigation strategy that is very important and will continue to emerge and get better over the planning horizon. Another example, moving water wells out of saltwater intrusion areas and increasing shelter capacity. So in the event of a disaster, that we have adequate facilities to accommodate evacuations and other needs. So now thinking about outreach and communication, as Gina mentioned in the survey overview, we heard that loud and clear that improved outreach, improved communication was paramount, and that folks in the county are desiring better and more informative ways to hear about and learn how to be prepared in the face of disasters. So increasing specific outreach to elderly and houseless communities, as well as multilingual outreach to hard to reach communities, is something that we certainly want to explore as part of this update. Increasing CERT training participants and creating community emergency response teams. So bringing in more resources to address emergencies and involving more folks than just the first responders. Also developing a county evacuation assistance program. That was another idea that came up in the event that evacuation is required, and it puts a pinch on individual households to be able to accommodate the evacuation, helping out with that so that it's more effective and not as burdensome to the community is one mitigation strategy that we're exploring. And then also collaboration. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, as a multi-jurisdictional plan, that's an inherent part of this project, is ensuring collaboration between different agencies. And that can become a specific mitigation measure, identifying specifics about how and when interagency coordination occurs. So then related to urban and human-caused hazards, you'll see a lot of this related to the pandemic. We've learned a lot of lessons about how to prepare for and respond to a pandemic. So including stockpiling personal protective equipment and coordinating with public health and the hospitals, healthcare workers on response, and more importantly, outreach to ensure that folks have the most current and best information to make good decisions. And also increasing public education related to those issues, and also specifically about other biological problems, including agricultural pests, invasive species. A lot of being able to control biological hazards is about educating people in advance to ensure that those problems don't become exacerbated for lack of knowledge. And then last but not least, thinking about how to be more resilient to cyber attacks. Our IT staff at the county are wizards at preventing cyber attacks. But that's an evolving landscape and requires continuous monitoring and continuous improvement to ensure that our IT infrastructure is resilient to cyber attacks. And then thinking last but not least about climate change. As I mentioned, climate change is an eminent issue. It's been something that we have been planning for years, and with each new update, it becomes more and more of an issue that we need to be mindful of and be proactive about planning for. So, for example, considering the frontline communities facing climate change related hazards. Right now, the County of Santa Barbara has recently released a draft climate change vulnerability assessment, identifying those frontline communities that are particularly vulnerable to climate change related hazards, including sea level rise, drought, extreme weather, et cetera. And so considering those communities when we're planning ahead for climate change effects is a particularly important strategy. Additionally, considering the priorities for increasing renewable energy use. The county is now part of the Monterey Bay Power organization that's providing renewable energy as readily available to all households and all businesses within the county. So encouraging participation in that program and other opportunities to increase renewable energy is part of the greater approach, consistent with the state of California's direction to reduce greenhouse gases and address climate change. Other topics including public transportation, changing to electric vehicles, establishing cooling and warming centers in key locations. This is particularly related to planning for extreme weather in the future. Other ideas including recycled water usage, increasing recycled water uses, finding new ways to recapture water before it becomes wastewater. And then ultimately planning ahead for climate change, including monitoring GHG emissions and developing adaptation strategies in response to the vulnerabilities that are identified in this plan and ongoing climate work that the county and other jurisdictions are doing. So with that, it's a quick survey. We wanted to give you, some food for thought, bring you up to speed on the work that's been done to date, some good brainstorming that the team has done to date on some of these issues. But now we want to hear from everybody here. So let me turn it over to Gina, and I want to encourage everybody to help inform this project by participating in our Slido exercises. Gina, go ahead and take the lead on this one. I'm really excited to hear some of the input that we'll receive from the group tonight.
Me too. I've been loving following along with your suggestions in the chat. So keep them coming. We're going to have a few focused questions and then an open question at the end for all your outstanding concerns. So if you haven't already, open up slido.com on a separate browser or on your phone, or you can scan this QR code and it'll take you right there. Again, our code for this event is 035676. And our first question is going to be, this one's pulled a little bit from the survey and adapted. What are your top hazards that you face in Santa Barbara County? And I think this one is a word cloud. So you can submit multiple answers, but do them one word at a time. And the most common responses will come up larger on the screen than the least common responses. So if you say wildfire, type that in, press enter, and then we'll see what else comes up. Or flooding, think about that hazard list that we provided earlier. And let us know if you're having any issues with that accessing the Slido. Okay, great. We have some folks who are able to get it. Yeah, development in the wildland-urban interface was a major theme of the public survey results too. People are really concerned about new development going into areas that are already prone to lots of different types of hazards. Flooding and earthquakes, those for some reason didn't rank as high in the public survey, but we know that they are low probability, high severity, so we'll definitely analyze them really thoroughly in the plan. Water shortage, drought, also popular answers. Cyber attacks, yeah, we'll definitely need some key mitigation strategies to help prepare government infrastructure for that. Impacts to the natural system. I'm interested in hearing more about that one. If anyone wants to elaborate on that in the chat, I'm curious as to what that entails. I'm seeing a connection between unaffordable housing and poverty, just making sure that it's likely that the most vulnerable communities will experience hazards the most severely. So that'll be taken into consideration in the mitigation strategies. If you agree with one of the things on here too, you can type the exact same thing in and it'll appear a little bit larger, like the wildfire and flooding already have. Yeah, 101 closure, that's definitely something that we're studying closely in this plan. We've seen it happen just even a few weeks ago because of the Alisal fire, and prevents people from getting to work, prevents people from being able to get to where they need to be, and that can be really scary when you don't know when it's going to reopen. Rotating outages, yep. Energy, I see power safety shutoffs on there as well. Thank you, Sharon, for clarifying that. Natural systems being impacts to the water supply, ecosystem health, etc. That can be caused by so many of the different hazards we talked about today too. I saw your comment earlier talking about, for example, debris flows affecting our water supply. I think that's a really interesting overlapping hazard issue. All right, let's move on to our next question here in a second. Ooh, it's so cool to see the word cloud change shape as people respond, but I want to get your input on a few other things and get to our mitigation strategy input as well. Thank you all for participating in this one. We're curious to hear, what hazards have you experienced in the last 5 years? Think about what's happened since 2017 in your world. This one is an open response question, so it's not a word cloud. You can type full sentences or phrases. And this one also asks for multiple responses, I believe. So if you have multiple thoughts or multiple things that have happened to you, you can share them as individual responses. Okay, so we have some folks who have been in the evacuation zone, people who have experienced fires locally. Makes sense seeing that we have a heavy South Coast representation here today, that fires would be and evacuations would be on people's minds for sure. Debris flows, of course, somebody who's been here since 2018 or maybe lives in the Alisal fire region. Also, if you haven't experienced hazards or you haven't experienced them severely, that could be helpful to understand too. Extreme heat without a place for relief. Something that came up in our stakeholder meetings and our public outreach was that people want more cooling centers and resiliency hubs. That was really popular. And people want to know where they are in advance. They want them to be supplied with materials that they'll need. Yeah, I'm seeing drought come up again, debris flows, power outages. Somebody here personally experienced a cyber attack. That's scary. I'm sure it's if you work for a government agency, that can happen more frequently. Yeah, thank you, Christina. We love Slido. We love collecting input this way because we can save it after the meeting too, and go back and read and rank people's responses and collect input that way. By ranking, I just mean collecting the number of people who said the same thing, and it helps us affirm which are the most popular responses. Lack of communication has to do with we need better outreach. Yeah, extreme heat because of the lack of air conditioning. I know my apartment does not have air conditioning. The only places I see that have air conditioning are businesses, which isn't the most reliable in case of emergency. Extreme wind, that's a new one on here. Air quality, we actually talked about recently with the Air Pollution Control District and how we can incorporate mitigation measures to help people breathe cleaner air during fire events. Smoke, yep. Outdoor workers. In the public survey, I remember somebody had a mitigation measure specifically calling for educating agricultural workers about extreme heat and providing outreach to them. That's something we're looking at as well. Challenges to evacuation, yep. Ash and smoke coming up again. Power outages, multiple people said that they've experienced a power outage in the past 5 years. And these things could become even more frequent because of climate change, so we need to study them really closely. All right, I'm going to move on to our next question. If you have more thoughts on these first two questions, feel free to type it in the chat, or we'll have a public comment period in a second. This next one is, what are the best ways to avoid or lessen these hazards? This one is also open response. You can submit multiple answers. You can do sentences, phrases, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. And for this, we're trying to get at what mitigation strategies do you want to see in the plan? What are some things that you want to see incorporated, or some things that you personally do to prepare for hazards? Land use changes to address hazard zones. I think one way this could take form is limiting development in high fire areas or floodplains. That was a popular response in the survey and for our stakeholder meetings. Yeah, we have a couple of mitigation strategies related to frontline communities, but we know we need to rely heavily on trusted community partners to make sure our outreach is relevant and timely. Vegetation management, especially eucalyptus trees, that came up a lot in the survey. Building codes, zoning, disaster preparedness training. Definitely love all of those strategies. Communication and coordination among emergency agencies. I think this has been especially apparent recently due to the pandemic. We know we need to include a mitigation strategy related to helping county public health, talk to the cities, talk to the state and federal health agencies. Defensible space. There's lots of grants available for that as well. Yeah, better planning. Hardening buildings, buying back buildings from vulnerable areas, better regional collaboration. Yeah, better vegetation management, supporting ecosystem health. That's a really good point. These suggestions are coming in so fast. Thank you all for these ideas. Yeah, something that we've heard a lot is not just offering English and Spanish outreach, but offering outreach in Mixteco or other languages that might be spoken throughout the county and making sure everyone's covered. Peer-to-peer learning. I'm wondering how that could take shape, like neighborhood outreach or community training. If you want to elaborate on that in the chat, I'd love to hear more. Yeah, proper staffing, resources, that's come up a lot in our stakeholder conversations. Shade access is going to be really important, especially in our urban areas that are that suffer from even more heated areas than rural spots that have more vegetation. Varying our energy production profile, folks really wanted to see more renewable energy in the public survey to help increase our resiliency. Yeah, broadband came up in the public survey too. People want to make sure that they have access to the emergency notifications. If you don't have internet, how are you even supposed to find out about some of these things? Desalination capacity, yep, that was popular as well. All right, with these slowing down, I think maybe it's time to go to our next question. These suggestions have been amazing. Thank you so much for typing so quickly and them all in there. So instead of just thinking about what your community can do or what you can do as an individual, think about larger government agencies. What can the County of Santa Barbara do to help avoid or lessen these hazards in your community? Things that are under the county's control or things that we know we can do from the top down. We want to hear mitigation strategies related to that. And some of them might overlap, that's totally okay, but you can make them more specific if you want to get a few more details in there. Fund staff capacity to address climate change. I like that, that's very specific. It could look like more staffing, more training for staffing. Receive and act on data that's available. One of our objectives that's still in draft form right now that we're working on is making sure that we're relying on the most recent data, the most up-to-date technology to make planning decisions, updating and refreshing our GIS regularly. Interagency coordination coming from the top down, especially from the county executive office. If you want to think about what cities could do as well, you can phrase that in your response. That could be useful too. We'll have annexes for each of our participating jurisdictions, and we can use those mitigation strategies there too. Collaborate with trusted partners. Yep, be present with them. Changing zoning, that's definitely something that's under the county's wheelhouse. I'm seeing staffing come up again. It's interesting that that's kind of a theme in these responses and resources. Supporting neighborhood networks, hubs, and network. We've seen a lot of responses in the public survey called out specific community groups that they trust, like Bucket Brigade was named a few times, that they would be comfortable receiving information from, and they collaborate regularly on. So that's definitely going to be wrapped into several mitigation strategies. People also said that they wanted more neighborhood outreach or having like designated people in their communities to turn to in emergency situations. So that could kind of fall under working with community leaders. Desalination coming up again. Yeah, managed retreat for areas of extreme risk. This has come up in a lot of coastal projects, but it could be relevant to floodplains or high fire severity zones as well. Yeah, it's something that we've been talking about a lot, is how to make this plan kind of flow and mesh with other planning efforts going on in the county right now, such as the housing element update. I think it's really important to bring that up. Yeah, on housing too, working to address houselessness. More education on what the county is capable of and what they're there for. These responses have been so helpful. It seems like it's trickling off, but now we're going to go into our open public comment period in a second, where we can get more open feedback if you have questions or thoughts on everything that's been presented so far. And for that, I'm going to hand it back to Erica to facilitate. And I just want to say thank you again for all of your wonderful feedback. These are really helpful, and we're recording all of them.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina. And thanks, everybody. I'm sitting back here watching this roll in, and this is exactly the type of conversation that we were hoping to have tonight. Some specifics, some clearly stated ideas that can be turned into mitigation measures that have timing requirements, monitoring requirements, and an implementation schedule. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much. We do want to have an opportunity to hear from folks. So this feedback is so great, but we do have an opportunity for public comment. If there's any comments or questions, suggestions that you'd like to share, anything that shook loose through this presentation, feel free to raise your hand to give a verbal comment. And please, if you could, it's getting late in the hour, and so if we can keep comments within 3 minutes, that'd be terrific. Also, if you have a question or comment, feel free to add it to the chat box, and we'd be happy to take those as well and provide any responses. Anybody with comments or questions to round out the evening? Great. Okay. Let's see. I have one hand raised from Sharon. Feel free to unmute your mic, and we'll be able to hear you.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, doing great.
Good. Great presentation. I really appreciate it. I did participate in the survey whenever it was out, so it's great to hear the results of that. I know you mentioned climate change throughout, but this one comment for me, it just felt as you continue to talk about it as sort of as an afterthought, it just feels like the whole idea of climate change needs to really be elevated as part of our emergencies. I mean, nobody's denying that it's really driving some of our emergencies and certainly deepening them. So it just felt a little bit throughout your presentation as if it was sort of and we're going to start including these, or it's starting to be an emerging issue. It feels to me like it's really much more integrated than that, and I would just love to see that elevated in the report in a much more deliberate way. So that would be my main comment.
I appreciate that comment. Yes, thanks, Sharon. And we agree. I think that's something that we want to make sure is in the forefront, that particularly for natural hazards related to drought, extreme weather, shoreline management, and sea level rise, things that are driven, hazards that are driven by climate issues. We want to make sure that that's an integral discussion with the existing, building from the existing setting for that hazard, acknowledging that setting will change in the future. So thank you. That's a really good comment. Great. Any other verbal comments? Oh, yes. Let's see. Christina, and followed by David.
Yeah, just wondering if you could expand a little bit about how this process has integrated into the climate change vulnerability assessment and also the safety element update.
Yes, that's a great question.
Related.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the short answer to that is that those documents and those planning processes are integral to this process, and they're 100% related to one another. So just for folks who give a little bit of detail, the climate change vulnerability assessment has been drafted and is available on the county's website from the sustainability division. Feel free to go read through it. It's a really interesting document and provides a lot of the direct inputs related to climate change that are directly informing our assessment and planning for mitigation. So there's that feedback loop between that process and this project where we're being directly informed by that work. At the same time, the county is undertaking an update of the seismic safety and safety element in the county, and that update will be directly informed by our work as well. So the mitigation strategies, the suggestions, the recommendations that come out of this planning process then go back into the general plan for the county and potentially the cities as well. So it becomes programs that are adopted and implemented locally. So like I said, short answer is that they're all interrelated, and the data from each of these processes is directly informative of each other. Okay, great. Next we have David.
Hi. I was thinking that, it's great that we're talking about climate change and the different mitigation strategies, I want to be sure that we're not focusing just on like the emissions reduction and stuff like that, because on the chance that we don't meet our emission goals, you know, we need to prepare for what's going to happen next.
That's a great comment. And David, I guess I can ask you a question. Are you, you know, specifically related to adaptation? So it's a two-step thing, you know, trying to avoid the potential impacts from climate change and mitigate them, but also in the eventuality that we're dealing with a climate-driven hazard, we're planning for adaptation and response. And so the short answer on that is absolutely. One other thing to know, and this is harkening back to Christina's comment about the relationship between different planning documents, is that the climate change vulnerability assessment being prepared by the county will eventually inform an adaptation strategy. So that's related to the safety element as an action item that, you know, turns the measures into actionable steps and measures in terms of adaptation. So that's something else to know as a tool going forward that would that is on the horizon. Okay, great. Next we have Sophie.
Hi, so in regard to alerting and educating the public on hazards, I heard that the County of Ventura has released a smoke alert system for farm workers, and this notifies them when the air quality index has reached 151, which is unhealthy, and that tells them that their employers are mandated to provide them N95 masks since they're still working on the fields. And I was wondering if this is something that Santa Barbara County has considered implementing or can consider implementing.
Mm-hmm. That's a great suggestion. Off the cuff, I don't have an answer about Santa Barbara's capabilities for that specific program, but that's a great idea, and let us look into that and be sure that we can address that particular idea as part of the mitigation plan. Great. Okay. We've had a couple comments come in. Let me just check here. Great. Okay. Thank you for these comments. So just a little bit of feedback on that. The note about compounding hazards. Absolutely. I think as Sydney was describing in our presentation of hazards and vulnerabilities, that debris flow is one of the best examples of compounding hazards. So the hazards of flooding, the hazards of wildfire combining to create a new hazard, a very specific hazard within the county. Another good example of this is the confluence of sea level rise and flooding, where wave run up and coastal erosion can become exacerbated by a combination of different factors. And that's something that the plan is addressing and identifying potential areas where overlapping hazards would create multiple hazards and multiple vulnerabilities from different angles. So that's a great point about that, and just to confirm that that's part of this project. Great. Let's see. We talked about alignment of plans, and then let's see. Great. Thank you, Christina, for this input using LiDAR data and historical analysis. Thank you for that. That's very valuable. Great. Great. And thank you, Sharon. Also, just to let everybody know that APCD is a member of our Mitigation Advisory Committee. So it's a multi-jurisdictional advisory committee involving the participating agencies and other responsible agencies that are involved in hazard mitigation, including APCD. So that's a great point. We'll be sure to bring that up with them. Okay, great. Any other comments, questions, verbal or written for tonight? Okay, well, thank you everyone so much for that input. We'll just wrap up our workshop tonight with a couple slides with some information about next steps. Terrific. So in terms of schedule, we wanted to make everyone aware of what's coming up in the next few months. The draft plan is scheduled to become available for public review this coming winter, 2021. based on public review, and we'll be preparing a final updated plan and seeking local adoptions in spring of 2022 with the intent of delivering the draft, or the I would say, proposed final plan to the approving bodies at the state and federal government. So that includes Cal OES and FEMA. And our deadline to adopt a new plan, to ensure that we have an adopted plan within our 5-year time frame and comply with the DMA of 2000, is September 2022. So that's our date that we're backing up from. So anticipate that you'll be seeing notifications from us. The draft plan will become available shortly. We'll be working with the participating agencies to ensure each annex for the cities and our 5 districts are updated and included in this update. And that's loosely what you can expect over the next few months. In terms of ways to stay involved in this project, we still have a lot of work to do. So we hope that you will stay engaged by following us on social media. Check out the project's website for regular updates. You can also join our mailing list. There's the website here, but you can also go to OEM's website to join the interested parties list and receive updates. Ultimately, you'll receive notification when the draft plan is available, and we'll be having future outreach events to review the draft plan and take comments on its content. So look forward to that in the coming months. And other than that, I just wanted to thank everybody for your time and your incredibly valuable input. It's been great to see such great thinking and direct input into this process. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to OEM and as a conduit to reach us, the planning team. We'll look forward to seeing you at future outreach events for this project. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.